Margaret Chen never imagined that moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into a nightmare. She was a simple woman with simple dreams. After years of living in the city, she finally saved enough money to buy a small house in Oakwood Hills, a peaceful community with tree-lined streets and friendly faces. Or so she thought. Margaret worked as a librarian at the local library. She loved her job, helping people find books and watching children discover the joy of reading. On weekends, she enjoyed working in her garden, planting colorful flowers and growing fresh vegetables. She was the kind of person who baked cookies for new neighbors and always had a warm smile ready for anyone who needed it. When she first moved in, everything seemed perfect. The houses were well maintained, the lawns were green, and people waved as they drove by. Margaret spent her first week unpacking boxes and making her new house feel like home. She hung pictures on the walls, arranged her furniture, and planted roses in the front yard. Her elderly mother was planning to visit soon for an extended stay, and Margaret wanted everything to be perfect. On her second week, she decided to introduce herself to the neighbors. She baked chocolate chip cookies, her specialty, and walked door to door with a bright smile. Most people were wonderful. Mrs. Peterson from next door invited her in for tea. The young couple across the street, Tom and Lisa, welcomed her warmly and offered to help if she ever needed anything. Even old Mr. Williams, who seemed grumpy at first, softened when she complimented his rose garden. But then she met Richard Drummond. Richard was the president of the Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it. He was a retired executive in his early 60s, the kind of man who wore polo shirts tucked into khaki pants even on casual days. He had perfectly combed gray hair and an expression that suggested he was always judging something or someone. Margaret knocked on his door with her plate of cookies, expecting the same friendly welcome she had received from others. Richard opened the door and looked at her with cold eyes, not even glancing at the cookies. "You must be the new owner of 247, he said, not bothering with pleasantries like asking her name. "Yes, I'm Margaret. I just wanted to introduce myself, and I'll need to schedule an inspection of your property," Richard interrupted. "New homeowners often don't understand our community standards. I've noticed several violations already." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Violations?" She had barely finished unpacking. "I'm sorry, what violations?" Richard pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, the kind someone might use to write down parking tickets. "Your mailbox is approximately half an inch taller than regulation height. Your flower pots are the wrong shade of terracotta according to our aesthetic guidelines, and your welcome mat extends 2 inches beyond the acceptable threshold from your doorway." Margaret stared at him, waiting for him to smile and say he was joking. He didn't smile. He was completely serious. "I'll send you a formal notice," Richard continued. "You have 2 weeks to correct these issues or you'll face a fine. Welcome to Oakwood Hills." He closed the door before Margaret could respond, leaving her standing on his porch with a plate of cookies and a growing sense of confusion. Over the next few days, Margaret did exactly what Richard demanded. She adjusted her mailbox, bought new flower pots in the exact shade specified in the HOA handbook, and moved her welcome mat back 2 inches. She didn't want any trouble. She just wanted to live peacefully in her new home. But Richard wasn't finished with her. The following week, she received another notice. This time, her garden hose was coiled incorrectly and visible from the street. The week after that, her trash bins were placed 6 inches too far to the left on collection day. Then it was the angle of her porch furniture. Each time, Margaret politely fixed whatever Richard complained about, always apologizing and promising to do better. The other neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Peterson pulled Margaret aside one afternoon while she was checking her mailbox. "Honey, you don't have to let him push you around like this," she said quietly, glancing toward Richard's house. "He's done this to 3 families before you. All of them eventually gave up and moved away. That's what he wants. He gets some kind of sick pleasure from making people miserable." Margaret smiled gently. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to cause any problems. If following the rules keeps the peace, I'm happy to do it." Mrs. Peterson shook her head sadly. "You're too nice for your own good. Just be careful. Richard doesn't stop until he wins." What none of them knew, what Margaret never thought to mention, was that she had spent 15 years of her life in Japan studying Okinawan karate. She had trained 6 days a week under Master Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the most respected instructors in the discipline. She had earned her 3rd-degree black belt, competed in international tournaments, and taught advanced students before returning to America to care for her aging parents. But that was a different life, a different version of herself. She had left competition behind, trading her GI for cardigans and her training hall for library shelves. Martial arts had been a personal journey, a path to inner peace and discipline. It wasn't something she felt the need to announce or display. It simply was part of who she had been, tucked away quietly in her past like the tournament medals she kept in a box in her closet. As Margaret watered her newly approved flower pots that evening, she had no idea that Richard's harassment was only beginning, and she certainly had no idea that her years of training, patience, and discipline would soon be put to the test in ways she never imagined. 3 weeks after Margaret moved in, her mother arrived for what was supposed to be a peaceful, extended visit. Her mother was 78 years old, recovering from a minor surgery, and Margaret was thrilled to have her stay while she healed. They spent the evenings watching old movies together and cooking her mother's traditional recipes that filled the house with warmth and familiar smells. On the third night of her mother's visit, Margaret woke up to find an orange envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Her heart sank. She knew exactly what it was before she even opened it. Another violation notice from Richard. The notice stated that her mother's car had been parked on the street overnight, which was apparently against HOA regulations. Margaret read it twice, confusion turning to frustration. She walked back inside and checked the HOA handbook she had studied cover to cover. There was nothing about overnight street parking being prohibited. In fact, the handbook specifically stated that street parking was allowed for guests. That afternoon, Margaret decided to address this directly. She walked to Richard's house and knocked politely. When he answered, she held up the notice with a calm smile. "Hello, Richard. I received this notice about my mother's car, but I checked the handbook and it says guest parking on the street is permitted." Richard looked at her with barely concealed contempt. "The handbook is outdated. There was a board meeting last month that changed the rules. Was there a notice sent out about the change? Residents are expected to attend meetings to stay informed," he said coldly. "I wasn't living here last month," Margaret replied, still keeping her voice gentle. "That's not my problem. The car needs to be moved into your driveway or garage by tonight, or you'll receive a fine." He started to close the door. "Richard, my mother is recovering from surgery. She needs her car close by in case of an emergency. My driveway only fits one car, and I need mine for work." "Could we possibly—" "Rules are rules," he snapped. "I don't make exceptions. Move the car or pay the fine." This time he did close the door, leaving Margaret standing there with the notice clutched in her hand. She moved her mother's car into the driveway and parked her own car on the street instead. The next morning, there was another orange envelope on her windshield. From that point on, Richard's harassment became relentless. He started showing up at her house unannounced, always with his little notebook and a measuring tape. He measured the height of her grass with a ruler, insisting it was 1/4 inch too long. He photographed her house from different angles, looking for any tiny imperfection he could cite. He sent certified letters about violations that seemed to come from his imagination rather than any actual rulebook. One letter claimed her garden gnome violated aesthetic codes. Another said her outdoor light fixture was the wrong style. He complained that her car was parked 3 inches too far from the curb. Each violation came with the threat of escalating fines. Margaret continued to comply with every demand, no matter how ridiculous. She removed the garden gnome her mother had given her as a housewarming gift. She replaced the light fixture at her own expense. She measured exactly where to park her car, but nothing was ever good enough for Richard. The other neighbors were outraged on her behalf. Tom from across the street offered to file a formal complaint against Richard with the HOA board, but Margaret declined. She didn't want to cause trouble or create divisions in the community. She believed that if she just remained patient and cooperative, Richard would eventually leave her alone. She was wrong. One sunny afternoon, Margaret was collecting her mail when Richard appeared beside her as if he had been waiting. He didn't bother with a greeting. "I need to discuss your continued disregard for community standards," he said, stepping uncomfortably close. Margaret took a small step back, maintaining her polite smile. "I've corrected everything you've asked me to, Richard. Is there something new?" "Your attitude is the problem," he said, his voice rising. "You're a disrespectful newcomer who doesn't understand how things work here. This is my neighborhood. I've been president of this HOA for 12 years, and I won't have someone like you undermining my authority. I'm not trying to undermine anything, Margaret said softly. I just want to live peacefully. Richard moved closer, invading her personal space. He pointed his finger inches from her face. You think you're so sweet and innocent with your cookies and your smiles? But I see right through you. You're trying to turn the neighbors against me. Margaret's body language shifted slightly. Her stance became more grounded. Her weight distributed evenly on both feet. Her breathing slowed, becoming deep and controlled. These were automatic responses trained into her through years of practice. But her voice remained gentle. Richard, please step back. You're too close. He laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Or what? What are you going to do about it? For just a moment, something flickered in Margaret's eyes. A sharp awareness, a coiled readiness that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Peterson, who was watching from her porch, noticed it. She later told her husband that for just a second, Margaret looked like a completely different person. But Margaret simply turned and walked away, her movements fluid and controlled. She went back into her house and closed the door gently, even as Richard called after her with more threats and accusations. That evening, Richard bragged to several neighbors at the community mailboxes that he had finally broken Margaret's spirit. She's scared now, he said with satisfaction. She'll either fall in line completely, or she'll move out like the others. Either way, I win. What Richard didn't know was that Margaret wasn't scared. She was being patient, giving him every opportunity to back down and behave like a reasonable adult. In her years of training, she had learned that the true measure of strength wasn't how quickly you could fight, but how long you could choose not to. But Richard's behavior was escalating, and Margaret knew from experience that bullies rarely stopped on their own. She hoped she was wrong. She hoped he would get bored and move on to someone else. She hoped she would never have to use the skills she had spent so many years developing. Deep down, though, she suspected that hope was running out. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the community pool. Margaret had never attended one before, but this time she had no choice. Richard had put her name on the agenda, calling for a vote to fine her $500 for what he called repeated violations and blatant disrespect of community standards. Margaret spent the previous evening preparing. She gathered copies of every notice Richard had sent her, along with photographs showing how she had corrected each violation. She had receipts for the new mailbox, the flower pots, the light fixture. She documented everything with dates and times. If Richard wanted to make this official, she would respond with facts and evidence. Her mother tried to convince her not to go. That man is dangerous, she said, worry creasing her face. Let me come with you at least. No, Mom, you need to rest. I'll be fine. There will be plenty of people there. Margaret squeezed her mother's hand reassuringly, though she felt far less confident than she sounded. When Margaret arrived at the pool area, about 40 residents were already seated in folding chairs arranged in rows. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked in. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed uncomfortable, probably dreading the confrontation they knew was coming. A few wouldn't meet her gaze at all. Richard stood at the front near a small podium, looking every bit like a king holding court. He wore a navy blazer despite the warm weather, and he held a thick folder that Margaret assumed was full of his documentation against her. The meeting started with routine business. Budget discussions, landscaping proposals, pool maintenance schedules. Margaret sat in the back row, her folder of evidence on her lap, her hands folded calmly on top of it. She focused on her breathing, keeping it steady and even, the way she had learned years ago. Finally, Richard called her name. We now address the matter of Margaret Chen, resident of 247 Maple Drive. Margaret, please come forward. She walked to the front, her steps quiet and measured. She could feel dozens of eyes following her. When she reached the front, Richard didn't ask her to sit. He wanted her standing, like a defendant before a judge. This resident has repeatedly violated HOA regulations since moving here 2 months ago, Richard began, opening his folder with theatrical flair. Despite numerous warnings and attempts to educate her on our community standards, she continues to show disregard for the rules that the rest of us follow without complaint. Margaret waited for him to finish. She had learned long ago that interrupting an aggressor often made things worse. Let them talk, let them exhaust themselves, then respond with calm facts. Richard listed violation after violation, some real, most exaggerated or invented. He claimed she was hostile when he tried to help her. He said she was trying to poison the community against him. He made her sound like a troublemaker who had brought chaos to their peaceful neighborhood. When he finally finished, he looked at her with barely concealed triumph. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Margaret opened her folder. Her voice was calm and clear as she addressed the room, not Richard. "I've corrected every violation that was brought to my attention. I have documentation here showing the before and after photos, the receipts for replacements, and the dates everything was completed." She held up the papers so everyone could see. "I've tried my best to follow the rules and be a good neighbor. I've never been hostile. I've been respectful and cooperative from day one." She paused, making eye contact with several residents who had been kind to her. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what I've done wrong that deserves a $500 fine." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people nodded. Tom from across the street called out, "I've never seen her do anything wrong. She's been nothing but friendly." Richard's face reddened. He hadn't expected her to defend herself so effectively. "This is not a debate," he snapped. "The violations are documented. The fine is appropriate. We need to maintain standards." "What standards?" Mrs. Peterson stood up from her seat. "You've been harassing this poor woman since she moved in." "We've all seen it. Sit down," Richard commanded. "You're out of order." "No, you're out of order," Mrs. Peterson shot back, and several people actually applauded. Richard's composure cracked. He slammed his folder down on the small table beside him. Papers scattered across the deck. "This is my meeting. I'm the president of this HOA, and what I say goes." Margaret bent down to help gather the scattered papers. It was an instinctive gesture of politeness, even in the middle of the confrontation. But Richard saw it as something else entirely. He saw it as submission, as weakness, as confirmation that he had won. He reached down and roughly shoved the papers from her hands, sending them flying across the pool deck again. The crowd gasped. Margaret stood up slowly, and those closest to her noticed her entire demeanor had shifted. Her breathing was different now, controlled and rhythmic. Her posture had changed, balanced and rooted. "Richard, that was unnecessary," she said quietly, but there was something new in her voice now. Steel beneath the silk. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You should pack up and leave before things get worse for you. This is your last warning." The threat hung in the air. Everyone was watching now, the entire meeting frozen in this moment. Margaret looked up at him, and her voice was still gentle but absolutely firm. "I've asked you repeatedly to respect my personal space. This is your final warning." Richard laughed in her face. Then he made the biggest mistake of his life. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "I said, you're done here. Let me escort you out." What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but everyone there would remember it in slow motion for the rest of their lives. Margaret's hand moved faster than most people could follow. She didn't pull away from his grip. Instead, she stepped slightly to the side, rotated her wrist in a smooth circle, and suddenly Richard's own momentum and strength were working against him. Her other hand came up to guide his elbow, and the combination of movements created a joint lock so perfect, so controlled, that Richard had no choice but to follow where his own body was being led. Down to his knees, the much larger man dropped to the pool deck with a yelp of pain and surprise, his face contorted in shock. Margaret held the lock for just a moment longer, enough to ensure he understood that she could have done much worse, then released him and stepped back immediately. The entire community sat in absolute silence. Richard knelt on the ground, clutching his wrist, his face bright red with pain and humiliation. Margaret stood above him, breathing normally, her expression almost apologetic. "I'm sorry I had to do that," she said softly, "but I couldn't allow the physical aggression to continue." For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was Richard's heavy breathing as he knelt on the pool deck, still clutching his. "Are you hurt?" she asked Richard, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to cause injury. I only needed to stop you from hurting me." Richard looked up at her with pure hatred in his eyes. He struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. "You attacked me. All of you saw it. She assaulted me. I'm calling the police. I'm going to sue you for everything you have." Before anyone could respond, a younger man stood up from the third row. His name was Kevin, and Margaret recognized him as someone who jogged past her house most mornings. He walked toward the front, pulling out his phone. "Actually, Richard, I recorded the whole thing," Kevin said calmly, holding up his device. "And I'm pretty sure at least 5 other people did too." He looked around and several residents nodded, holding up their own phones. "The video shows very clearly that you grabbed her first. She was defending herself after you physically assaulted her. If anyone's calling the police, maybe we should talk about what you did." Richard's face went from purple to pale. He looked around the room, finally seeming to realize that the crowd wasn't on his side. They were all staring at him with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction, like they had been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to him. Mrs. Peterson spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "I think we all have some questions for Margaret. But first, Richard, you need to sit down and be quiet for once in your life." Margaret raised her hand gently. "It's okay. I understand everyone must be confused. I should explain." Kevin gestured toward her with obvious interest. "That technique you used, that was a kotegaeshi, wasn't it? A wrist lock throw? Where did you train?" Margaret hesitated. She had spent 2 months in this neighborhood trying to blend in, trying to be invisible, trying not to make waves. Now everyone was staring at her, waiting for answers. She took a deep breath. "I lived in Japan for 15 years, she began quietly. "I studied Okinawan karate under Master Takeshi Yamamoto. He was one of the most respected instructors in traditional martial arts. I trained 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day. Eventually I earned my 3rd-degree black belt." The crowd murmured in amazement. Kevin's eyes went wide. "Master Yamamoto? I've read about him. He only accepts serious students. Getting to 3rd degree under him must have taken incredible dedication." Margaret nodded. "It was my life for a long time. I competed internationally for several years. But then my parents got older and needed help, so I came back to the States. I left that world behind. It wasn't something I felt the need to talk about. It was just part of my past." "Just part of your past?" Tom from across the street stood up, laughing in disbelief. "You're like a secret superhero who's been living among us this whole time and you never said anything?" Margaret smiled, slightly embarrassed. "It's not like that. I'm just a librarian who used to practice martial arts. I haven't competed or even trained seriously in over 5 years. I just wanted a quiet life here." "Well, you picked the wrong neighborhood for quiet," Mrs. Peterson said, glancing pointedly at Richard. "Not with him running things." Dorothy Kim, who had been silent until now, stood up from her seat in the front row. She was the HOA vice president, a position that had always been ceremonial because Richard made all the real decisions. She was a soft-spoken woman in her late 50s who rarely contradicted anyone. But now she walked to the front and stood next to Margaret, facing Richard. "I think we've all tolerated your behavior for far too long," Dorothy said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "You've bullied residents. You've made up rules that don't exist. You've driven good people out of this neighborhood because you enjoy having power over others." "You can't talk to me like that," Richard sputtered. "I'm the president. I'll have you removed from the board." "No," Dorothy said firmly. "I'm calling for an emergency vote right now to remove you as HOA president, effective immediately. Do I have a second?" "Seconded." At least 10 voices called out at once. Richard looked around desperately. "You can't do this. This is a conspiracy. You're all turning against me because of some woman who attacked me." Kevin held up his phone again. "We have video evidence that you assaulted her, Richard. She defended herself using minimal force. If anything, she showed remarkable restraint. Someone with her training could have really hurt you, but she only did what was necessary to stop you." Dorothy called for the vote. "All in favor of removing Richard Drummond as HOA president, say aye." The response was overwhelming. "Hey!" It echoed across the pool area. Voices united for perhaps the first time in years. All opposed? Silence. Even Richard's few friends stayed quiet, unwilling to defend his behavior any longer. "The motion passes unanimously," Dorothy announced, and several people actually applauded. "Richard, you're removed from the board effective immediately. Please leave the meeting." Richard stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For 12 years he had ruled this neighborhood like his personal kingdom. And now, in a matter of minutes, it was all gone. He looked at Margaret one last time, his expression full of venom. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Mrs. Peterson called out. "And if you try anything else, we all have video evidence now, so I suggest you accept it and move on." Richard grabbed his folder and his jacket and stormed out of the pool area. Everyone watched him go, and once he was out of sight, the tension in the air seemed to evaporate. People started talking excitedly, some laughing with relief, others still processing what they had just witnessed. Dorothy turned to Margaret with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I've wanted to stand up to him for years, but I never had the courage. Watching you defend yourself, seeing that he could be stopped, it gave me the strength I needed." Margaret took Dorothy's hand. "You always had that strength. You just needed the right moment to use it." Kevin approached Margaret with a respectful nod. "I teach martial arts at the gym downtown. Basic self-defense classes. What you did today was textbook perfect. Have you considered teaching again?" Margaret shook her head. "I left that life behind. I'm happy just being a librarian." "Maybe," Kevin said thoughtfully. "But I think a lot of people here could benefit from what you know. Not just the physical techniques, but the confidence that comes with knowing you can protect yourself. Think about it." As the meeting broke up and people started to leave, dozens of residents came up to Margaret. They thanked her. They apologized for not speaking up sooner. They told her stories of how Richard had bullied them too, and how good it felt to finally see him lose his power. Margaret listened to each one with patience and kindness, the same way she always did. But inside she felt something shifting. Maybe her past didn't have to stay buried. Maybe the skills she had learned all those years ago could serve a new purpose, maybe. It was time to stop hiding. The weeks following the pool incident brought changes to Oakwood Hills that nobody could have predicted. Dorothy took over as HOA president, and her first action was to call a special meeting to review all of Richard's rules. She brought copies of the original HOA charter from when the neighborhood was first built, and everyone was shocked to discover how many of Richard's regulations had simply been made up over the years. The ridiculous rules about mailbox heights, flower pot colors, and welcome mat placement were all removed. Dorothy established a new policy that any rule changes had to be voted on by the entire community, not decided by one person. The neighborhood handbook was rewritten to be clear, reasonable, and actually helpful instead of a tool for harassment. Margaret watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, but she tried to stay out of the spotlight. She went back to her routine of work at the library, gardening on weekends and taking care of her mother. She hoped that everything would return to normal, that people would forget what had happened and just let her live peacefully. But the neighborhood had other ideas. It started with Mrs. Peterson knocking on her door one evening, accompanied by 3 other women from the community. They looked nervous but determined. "Margaret, we have a favor to ask," Mrs. Peterson began. "We've been talking, and several of us have had experiences where we felt unsafe or powerless. Watching what you did at the pool, how calm and confident you were, it made us think, would you consider teaching us some basic self-defense?" Margaret was caught off guard. "Oh, I don't know. I haven't taught in years, and I'm not really—" "Please," one of the other women interrupted. "Richard made me feel scared in my own neighborhood for 3 years. I don't ever want to feel that helpless again. You don't have to teach us to be experts, just enough so we know we can protect ourselves if we need to." Margaret looked at their faces, saw the genuine need there, and felt something stir in her heart. "Let me think about it," she said finally. That night, she talked with her mother over tea. Her mother, who had watched her daughter transform from a shy young woman into a confident martial artist and back into someone who seemed determined to disappear, listened carefully. "You know what your master Yamamoto used to tell you?" her mother said. "That true strength is knowing when to fight and when not to, but it's also knowing when to share what you've learned. These people need what you have to offer, not just the techniques, but the confidence, the knowledge that they don't have to be victims." Margaret smiled. Her mother was right, as usual. The next week, Margaret organized a small self-defense class at the community center. She expected maybe 5 or 6 people. 23 showed up, including several men. Kevin, the martial arts instructor, came too, eager to learn from someone trained by a legendary master. Margaret started with the basics. Not flashy moves or complicated techniques, but simple, practical skills. How to be aware of your surroundings, how to stand with confidence, how to use your voice as a first line of defense, how to break free from common grabs and holds. But more than the physical techniques, she taught them philosophy. "The goal is never to fight," she explained. "The goal is to be strong enough that people don't challenge you in the first place, and if they do, you handle it with the minimum force necessary. What I did to Richard wasn't about revenge or showing off. It was about stopping someone from hurting me, nothing more. The classes became a weekly tradition. Word spread beyond Oakwood Hills, and soon people from neighboring communities were asking to join. Margaret kept the group small and focused on those who genuinely wanted to learn for the right reasons, not people looking to become aggressive or dominate others. Meanwhile, Richard tried to make one last play for power. He showed up at an HOA meeting 2 months after his removal, claiming the vote had been illegal and demanding to be reinstated. But the neighborhood was different now. People who had once cowered before him stood up calmly and told him to leave. When he refused, Dorothy simply pulled out her phone and called the police for trespassing. Richard left without another word, and 3 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on his lawn. The day he moved out, several neighbors admitted they were throwing quiet celebrations in their homes. Margaret didn't celebrate, but she did feel a sense of peace knowing that particular chapter was finally closed. Tom and his wife Lisa stopped by Margaret's house the day Richard's moving truck pulled away. "You know what you did, right?" Tom asked with a grin. "You didn't just stop one bully. You showed everyone in this neighborhood that they had power too. Dorothy never would have found her voice if you hadn't found yours first." Margaret's mother, who was sitting on the porch with them enjoying the evening air, laughed softly. "That's my daughter. She spent 15 years learning how to fight, and she uses it to teach people how not to be victims. I always knew she was special, but I loved that she never needed to prove it to anyone. Until someone needed protecting," Lisa added. Then she did exactly what needed to be done. The community center classes continued to grow. Margaret brought in guest instructors, including Kevin, who taught different styles and perspectives. The classes became about more than self-defense. They became about building a community of people who looked out for each other, who stood up for each other, who refused to let anyone make them feel small or afraid. One evening, after a particularly good class, an older gentleman approached Margaret. He had been taking classes for a month and had barely spoken to anyone. "I just wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "My wife passed away last year and I've felt vulnerable ever since. Being alone at my age, I worried about everything. These classes have given me back something I thought I'd lost. Not just the ability to defend myself, but the confidence to live without fear." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This was why Master Yamamoto had been so passionate about teaching. Not to create fighters, but to create people who were strong enough to live fully without being controlled by fear. As she walked home that evening, passing houses where lights glowed warmly and families gathered, Margaret reflected on her journey. She had come to Oakwood Hills looking for peace and quiet, hoping to fade into the background. Instead, she had found her purpose again. She wasn't just a librarian anymore. She wasn't just a retired martial artist. She was someone who had used her strength to help others find theirs. And in doing so, she had transformed an entire community from one ruled by fear into one built on mutual respect and support. The next morning, Margaret watered her flowers, the ones in the pots she had bought to satisfy Richard's made-up rules. She smiled, thinking about replacing them with the colorful, mismatched pots she actually liked. Then she headed to the library, where a group of children waited for story time, and later to the community center, where 24 people waited to learn that they were stronger than they ever imagined. It wasn't the quiet life she had planned. It was better,